There are stories that get buried, not lost, buried, deliberately placed somewhere deep in the official record where no one is likely to find them. And then there are stories that get buried twice because the first time wasn't enough. This is one of those stories. In the spring of 1921, the federal government sent men into every county of every state in America to count the population. Doors were knocked on, names were recorded. The census was, by design, total. It reached into fishing villages in coastal Maine and into cattle towns on the Texas flatlands. It reached sharecropper cabins in the Mississippi Delta and into the mill towns of Ohio. It was supposed to reach everywhere, but in Leslie County, Kentucky, in a place that locals called Vester's Hollow, the census taker stopped at the tree line. He turned around. He went back down the mountain and filed a report that contained 6 words that have never been properly explained. Unable to complete enumeration, hollow, impassable. Impassable, that was the word he used, and yet by every account available, the road into Vester's Hollow was no different in the spring of 1921 than it had been the spring before or the spring before that. Men had walked it. Goods had moved along it. A family had lived at the end of it for as long as anyone in Leslie County could remember. The hollow was not impassable. The census takers simply would not enter it. Before we go any further, drop your location in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Because by the time this story is finished, I think you'll understand why a man with a federal mandate and a government salary turned his back on a trail he could clearly walk. Leslie County, Kentucky in 1921 was a place that existed in a different time than the rest of America. The Great War had just ended. Radios were starting to appear in city living rooms. Automobiles were reshaping the roads of the country. None of that had arrived yet in the eastern mountain counties. The Cumberland Plateau rose steep and dense and ancient around the small communities that clung to its river valleys, and the men and women who lived there had more in common with their great-grandparents than with anyone in Louisville or Cincinnati. A physician might come through Leslie County once a month if the roads allowed. A lawman operated out of a courthouse more than 30 miles away by the only reliable road. The nearest telegraph station was in Hyden. Most communication between mountain families happened through church meetings and by children sent down muddy trails carrying folded notes. When something went wrong in one of those remote hollows, the mechanism for responding to it was slow and imperfect and frequently never came at all. Vester's Hollow sat approximately 4 miles off the main road that ran through the county, accessible by a logging track that switchbacked up through old-growth timber and crossed a shallow creek twice before it opened into a cleared bowl between 2 ridgelines. By Leslie County standards, this was not unusual country. There were dozens of hollows just like it within the county alone. Men had built lives in them for generations. The hollow took its name from the family that had settled there longest, the Vesters. By 1921, the Vester presence in that hollow had lasted for nearly 60 years. The patriarch, Amos Vester, had come up from Harlan County sometime in the 1860s with a young wife and 2 sons and had built a cabin on the flat ground at the bottom of the bowl where a cold spring ran year-round. He had died in 1899. His wife, Elna, had died the following winter. Of the 2 sons, Corbett and Dolan, both were still living as of 1921, still occupying the original homestead and a second cabin built somewhat higher on the ridge. Corbett Vester was 53 years old by that spring. He was a lean, raw-boned man with a build that had been shaped by 40 years of mountain labor, limbs that were roppy and efficient rather than broad, hands so calloused they were said to feel like boot leather, 2 fingers on his left hand bent at angles that suggested breaks healed without setting. His eyes were the color of creek water in late October, pale brown shot through with green. He had never married. He had, by all accounts, gathered from neighbors who visited occasionally, a habit of standing at a great distance from any arriving visitor and watching them make the last portion of their approach before he ever said a word. His brother Dolan was 4 years younger and heavier with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had learned early that haste in the mountains cost more than it saved. Dolan had married once in 1904. His wife, a woman named Cora, born Cora Pruitt out of Breathitt County, had moved into the hollow with him. For the first decade of their arrangement, nothing seemed wrong. The Vesters were known in the county as private people, peculiar, some said, but harmless. They came down to trade when they needed to. They appeared at church perhaps 4 or 5 times a year. They answered questions with the minimum number of words required and declined invitations. That was not uncommon behavior in the eastern mountains. People did not comment on it. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong in Vester's Hollow came not from any missing person or act of violence, but from a voice, specifically, from a voice that a 10-year-old boy named Hardy Combs claimed to have heard while he was cutting through the timber above the hollow in the fall of 1917. Hardy Combs was the son of Roscoe Combs, a timberman who lived 2 ridges over from Vester's Hollow. He was, by every account his father and schoolteacher gave, a practical boy, not imaginative, not prone to invention. Roscoe Combs would say this about his son to anyone who asked for the next 20 years. What Hardy Combs reported to his father that evening was this. He had been walking along the high timber line when he had heard, rising from the bowl of the hollow below, a sound that he first took for an animal, a long, low, repetitive sound. After a moment he understood it was a human voice, a woman's voice, speaking in what sounded to him like a language he did not recognize. Not English. Not anything he could name. The same sequence of syllables repeated again and again at long intervals, like something being recited from memory. He had stood at the tree line for a minute, perhaps 2, and then he had left quickly. He did not go back. Roscoe Combs noted the incident in a personal diary he kept throughout his adult life. That diary was donated to the Leslie County Historical Society by his granddaughter in 1979 and remains in their collection. The entry reads simply, Hardy came home from the timber troubled, said he heard Cora Vester up in the hollow saying words he didn't know. I told him it was nothing. I'm not sure I believe that. Nobody in the county did anything about a boy hearing an unfamiliar sound from a woman's property. There was nothing to do. But the entry is notable for one reason. Roscoe Combs did not say Cora Vester was chanting or praying or speaking strangely. He used the word nothing, because nothing was the acceptable response. His diary says otherwise. In March of 1919, Cora Vester's sister, a woman named Lottie Pruitt Sizemore, who lived in Hazard, Kentucky, wrote a letter to the Leslie County Sheriff's Office. That letter no longer exists in the county records, but its substance was described in a deposition given by Sheriff Garland Fugate in 1923. According to Fugate, Lottie Sizemore wrote that she had not received a letter from her sister Cora in 14 months, and that the last letter she had received had contained a passage she found, in her words, frightening in its meaning. Fugate acknowledged in his deposition that he had done little with this correspondence. He sent a deputy, a young man named Creed Blevins, to ride up to the hollow and make inquiries. Blevins returned and reported that he had spoken with Dolan Vester at the tree line, not at the cabin, at the tree line, and that Dolan had told him Cora was in good health but unwell in her nerves and not receiving visitors. Blevins filed a brief written report that confirmed the visit took place. He noted one detail that was almost certainly more significant than he understood at the time. He had not heard or seen any children in or around the property, though county records indicated that Cora and Dolan Vester had produced at least 2 children by 1915. Blevins's report is in the Leslie County Courthouse archive. In a margin note, apparently added later, in different ink, someone, the handwriting matches Fugate's, wrote 3 words. Where are they? Nobody asked that question formally. Nobody went back. Then came October of 1920 and a man named Everett Brashear. Brashear was a timber scout employed by the Consolidated Coal and Timber Company out of Harlan. His job was to travel remote hollows and ridges, assess the timber value of standing old growth, and report back to his employers. He was 41 years old, experienced in the mountain country, and described by his supervisor in a company record as a man not easily troubled. On October 14, 1920, according to a statement he gave the following month, Everett Brashear entered Vester's Hollow to assess the timber on its upper slopes. He had been told the hollow was privately held land and that he should make no contact with the Vester family. He worked the upper timber for most of the morning without incident. Around midday, he said, he became aware of a sound from the direction of the cabin below. Not a voice this time, a rhythm, a soft, repeated percussion, like something being struck methodically against wood or stone. He worked another hour. The sound continued without interruption throughout that time. The same rhythm, the same pace, neither quickening nor slowing. He packed his survey equipment and descended toward the logging track. His route took him along the outer edge of the cleared ground around the cabin. He did not go close, but he was close enough to see 2 things. The first was Corbett Vester standing at the corner of the main cabin, watching Brashear with the still, flat attention of a man who had been watching for some time and had no intention of pretending otherwise. The second was that the source of the rhythmic sound was Cora Vester. She was seated on the ground near the spring, maybe 50 yards from Brashear's position. She was rocking, steadily, slowly forward and back. Her lips were moving. There was a long piece of rope laid out in a deliberate shape on the ground in front of her. Brashear described the shape in his statement to a company official. He described it as a series of loops and crossings that he took at first for some kind of snare or trap arrangement. But the rope appeared to have been arranged with great care, and Cora Vester appeared to be engaged in a deliberate ritual around it. Brashear filed a formal statement with his employer. In that statement, he described what he saw with accuracy and without embellishment. He then added at the end a single sentence that was not strictly required for a timber survey report. "I do not know what is happening in that hollow, but I believe the county should look into it." The county did not look into it. Not then. Pause here. Because this is the thing that needs to be understood about what was happening in Investors Hollow. Three separate individuals, a 10-year-old boy, a county deputy, and a professional survey man, had each encountered something at or near that property that they had found worth documenting. 3 times, the official response was silence. This is not unusual. In the Eastern Mountains in 1920, the threshold for official action was extraordinarily high. Families in remote hollows were expected to govern themselves. A woman rocking by a spring was not a crime. A man standing at the edge of his property was not a crime. Strange sounds from a private hollow were not a crime, but here is what we now know. According to a sworn statement given to the Leslie County Circuit Court in the fall of 1923, a statement that was sealed for 11 years and finally made part of the public record in 1934, Dolan Vester had killed Cora Pruitt Vester sometime in the winter of 1918. Not quickly, not cleanly. The statement, which Dolan gave himself, described the circumstances in a way that suggested a prolonged period of what he called correction, which had begun by his own account several years before her death. The 2 children, a girl of 8 and a boy of 6 at the time of their mother's death, were both gone by the winter of 1918 as well. Dolan Vester's statement regarding the children was entered into the court record and subsequently withdrawn by court order and has not been available to researchers since. The only description of its contents comes from a newspaper account in the Hazard Herald from October 1923, which described the statement as containing details so disturbing in their nature that this publication will not reproduce them. What the court record does contain in full is the account of the federal investigator who finally entered Vester's Hollow in late August of 1923, after the census incident and subsequent complaints from Lottie Sizemore, now represented by an attorney in Hazard, finally forced a formal response. The investigator's name was Thomas Ard. He was from the Department of Justice. He entered the hollow with 2 deputies and a county physician named Bascom Harrell. What they found in the original Vester cabin, in a root cellar beneath the main floor, was consistent with what Dolan Vester had described in his statement. Ard's report does not use the words disturbing or horrifying. It uses the language of federal documentation, but the physical inventory of what was found in that cellar, cataloged in plain, methodical sentences, represents one of the most complete records of prolonged domestic violence and its concealment to survive in the public. Archives of that era in this region, the root cellar had been sealed from above. It had been sealed, according to Harrell's physical examination of the structure, for not less than 3 years. What Ard wrote in the final line of his investigative report was this: the property should be razed and the ground examined in full. No structure should remain here. Corbett Vester, who had lived in the hollow alongside his brother throughout this entire period, was interviewed by Thomas Ard for 11 hours across 2 days. He was never charged with any crime. The transcript of those interviews was included in Ard's full report, which was forwarded to the Department of Justice in Washington and classified for 30 years. When it was finally released in the 1950s, the interview transcript had been removed. Only Ard's summary remained. The summary stated that Corbett Vester had provided information of substantial use to the investigation. It stated that he had been aware of certain events in the hollow. It stated that the degree of his participation in those events had not been determined to the satisfaction of federal investigators. He returned to the hollow after the investigation closed. The Census Bureau's 1930 records show him listed as the sole occupant of the property in Leslie County, Kentucky. His age is given as 62. His occupation is listed as farmer. There is a notation in the enumerator's log beside his entry: subject cooperative, no difficulties. He died in 1941. He is buried in a churchyard in Hyden. The original cabin was never razed. The hollow was never examined in full. Thomas Ard's recommendation was never implemented. Today, that parcel of land in Leslie County is held in private ownership under a trust that has not been contested or examined since the 1960s. The logging tract that once provided access has been overgrown for decades. The Forest Service maps for the area do not mark it as protected land. They simply do not mark it at all. A local historian who attempted to visit the site in 1988. His account was published in the Appalachian Heritage Quarterly, reported that he walked the old track as far as the first Creekwa crossing before stopped. He wrote that he stopped because he became aware of a sound he could not account for rising from the bowl of the hollow below. He described it as low, rhythmic, and repetitive. He turned around. He did not go back. What do you do with a story like this? What do you do with a record that is simultaneously too complete and too broken to give you everything you need? Here is the question that has stayed with me since I first found this case in the Leslie County Archive. Corbett Vester lived in that hollow for the entire duration of what his brother did there. He lived 40 yards from that sealed root cellar. He spoke to the deputy at the tree line. He stood at the corner of the cabin and watched Everett Brashear walk past. He knew what was in the ground beneath the floor of the cabin he had lived in his whole life, and then he went back. After the investigation, after the bodies, he went back and he lived there for another 18 years, and he died there essentially, and he is buried in a churchyard less than 40 miles from the place where he spent his life saying nothing. Is that a man who participated in an unforgivable act, or is that a man who was trapped by blood, by geography, by the impenetrable logic of the mountain hollow, in a situation he could not escape and could not report and could only survive by learning, slowly and permanently, to unsee what he saw every day? I do not think the answer is simple. I do not think it ever is. This is one of the most disturbing cases I have come across in all of this research, not because of the violence, as terrible as it was, but because of the silence around it. The years of it, the institutional silence, the neighborly silence, the silence of a man who watched and said nothing for the better part of 2 decades. Tell me in the comments, do you think Corbett Vester was complicit, or was he a prisoner in everything but name? There are 2 sides to that question, and I have heard strong arguments for both. Drop your answer below. If this story has stayed with you, and you want to follow us deeper into the histories that were buried and sealed and quietly left off the maps, subscribe and ring the bell. We have more of these. They do not get easier, but they are real. The hollow is still there. The Census Bureau still has that notation in the 1921 ledger. And whatever the enumerator heard or saw or simply felt standing at that tree line in the spring of 1921 that made him write the word impassable about a road any man could walk that has never been explained. Stay out of the hollows and keep your doors locked tonight.